and decided he was going to be an engineer. And he did a mechanical engineering course and didn't like that so much, so became an electrical engineer. And he ended up with 4 engineering degrees. In his life, he ended up with a sum total of 9. Now, I don't know anyone else, and I've never heard of anyone else in the world who's got 9 university degrees. Anyone? He's the most educated man I've ever met. His LLD was, he got in 1986, just before he retired. And obviously was subsequently Dr. Clifton Gray Rattray. But he enlisted, or he then he decided he didn't actually want to be an engineer, and he decided it was time to be an attorney, and he worked for Spoor and Fisher. There we go. So I want to get all these things right. I actually have this very wonderful thing written by Nico Vermaak. I don't know if any of you, the lawmen probably read this. It's fabulous. And it's just to help me correct some dates if I do get them wrong, or names like Spoor and Fisher. And I think he finished his LLB in 1956. But prior to that, and he was a really good cricketer, as I said to you earlier, there was this young lady who was watching cricket. I think it was at the Wanderers, in fact. And her name was Gillian Gittard. And Gillian obviously bowled him over, to use the cricketing analogy. And they married in December of 1954. They had 3 children. Julia, whose godmother is sitting right here in front of me. Am I right? Yeah. And Julia is a very... The remarkable thing about this couple, if you've got a man who's so incredibly educated, Gillian was an unbelievable artist and author. She wrote 4 books, mostly around gardens. The first one was The Springing of the Year, which is about fugitive drift, which we'll talk about in a little while. Then she did one on Mala Mala. Different Rattrays, by the way. No relation of ours, unfortunately. And, well, we are related somewhere along the line, if one goes back a long way. But you were neighbours with them for quite a long time. And they produced 3 exceptionally talented children. How often does that happen? That you can end up with Julia, who was editor of Country Life, an incredible photographic journalist. David, my father, who was known worldwide as a public speaker, and obviously with the history, which we'll delve into a little bit. And then Martin, who changed the architecture of Plettenberg Bay for the better, I think. And all you have to do is cast your eye around this lovely place, and I am inherently biased too because it is my home. But he was an exceptionally talented man, was Martin. So they produced these 3 exceptionally talented children, and we'll talk a little bit about them as we move along through the story. And in the early 1960s, Peter was introduced to a character of a man by the name of George Bunting. Now, George Bunting, 2 T's in Bunting, was, I suppose, what one would consider anyone related to George, because he had relations all over. No? So George, I think one could probably classify him as a hillbilly. But the greatest white authority on the Zulu nation that the world has ever known. And George lived on the farm Fugitives Drift in a converted stable, farmed cattle, and people would come from all over the world to hear the stories that George would tell. And the reason that this came about, in terms of George's expertise on the Zulus, is that George grew up on the top of a mountain called Kuteni. And Kuteni is the highest point in Zululand, 6,000 feet above sea level. And it's in a rain shadow. You've got to be as tough as old boots to survive in that part of the world. And he grew up, he was born in 1911, was George, so they were quite similar age, George and my grandfather. And George was sent to school in Durban. It was a 2-day horse ride to the railhead at Glencoe to catch the train to Durban to go to school. And this is in 1917, age 6. And George was chaperoned along the way by an old Zulu man who wore a head ring and a kaross, and his name was Shezi. And Shezi had fought at the Battle of Isandlwana. And Shazi and George would ride out and they would camp at Isandlwana. And they'd make a little fire and they'd take the blankets off the horses, and that's what they'd use to sleep on. Remember, they were poor as church mice. And they'd get a fire going. And Shazi, it'd be cold in the middle of winter in that part of the world. Shazi would put a British military greatcoat over the shoulders of this young boy that he'd taken from a dead man at Isandlwana. And it was the magic of this old Zulu storytelling ability around the campfire that molded this baby Bunting into this authority that he became. And Peter heard about George. And he said, I need to go and see this man. In about 1961, he went there to go and see this character that was George. Put the whole family in the car. It was about a 9-hour drive from Johannesburg in those days. It's now about 5. 14 gates, farm gates in the last 15 miles or so that you had to stop and open. And close, exactly. And obviously the kids were made to do that. And it was this meeting of these two that created or sparked this love of the Zulu people, and particularly the Anglo-Zulu War. He was already an expert on the Boer War at this point, was Peter. His library was something to behold on these two subjects. But they met and instantly became friends, and they'd jump into these old, I've got to try and remember the type of car that it was. It doesn't really matter, but you know those old big Buick-y type vehicles that everyone drove in those days, and they'd bumble out into Zululand and go and find these old men who had either fought at Isandlwana, whose fathers had fought, or as young boys had watched the battle. And they would retell these stories and this wonderful oral tradition. And because when you haven't got a written history and it's oral, it has to be accurate. Otherwise it's lost. So there's very little broken telephone. It's remarkable. And the other thing that happens amongst the Zulus is because of polygamy, you've got these incredible generational gaps between, you've got men in their 70s and 80s siring children. So I've got, we still have a guide at Fugitive Drift whose grandfather fought at Isandlwana. And you try and tell that to someone from abroad who doesn't know that this is a polygamous society and that these old men can fight. He never met his grandfather, of course. But it's not impossible to have an 80-year-old generational gap. And so you get this passing on of the history. And I'll never forget my father telling me a story as a young boy, when he was a young boy, I should say, going to visit George. And George, being a cattle farmer, constantly covered in manure. And what George would do, and I'm looking at that fork and thinking I should do the same thing, but I won't. But he would take the fork off the table while he's telling his stories, and he would clean the underside of his fingernail. And then he'd take the serviette and he'd give it a bit of a polish and he'd put it back on the table. And the fear that this struck into these people around the table going, I wonder if I'm going to get that fork tomorrow. And anyway, so they'd all get loaded in the car and they'd go and talk to these old men. And my father, as a young boy, was dragged along kicking and screaming because he wanted to go fishing. And I remember the same thing happening to us as young kids. And thank God he did that, because I was very fortunate, and my brothers and I, to meet and talk to an old man. He didn't know how old he was. His name was Bantu Bezwan Tanzi. And he was the last man that anyone knows of whose father fought at Isandlwana. There you're talking 140 years of history in this old man. He's now dead. And anyway, so this interest in this area came about, and I think in a lot of ways, the sitting on the slopes of Isandlwana talking to men who had fought at Isandlwana and seen the horrors that had happened on that day was a bit of therapy for this man who was so terribly traumatized by Operation Pedestal. I think it fixed him. And in 1963, George managed to get hold of Peter and said, the farm next door is for sale, do you want to buy it? He said, yes. And he bought it. And that was the farm West Kirby, and the farm next door called Petruscar, West Kirby on the Wirral, for those from the UK, and that's where it was named after, because the surveyor had come from that part of the world and decided, oh, well, we'll just call this one West Kirby. It didn't look anything like it, but anyway. And he bought the farm next door to George, which is where Fugitive Drift Lodge is today. And that was the start of this visiting that. And if any of you have read Jill's book, The Springing of the Year, that was all written about her time at Fugitive Drift. Or the visiting to Fugitive Drift. They never lived there. And things kind of bumbled along for a while, all the while gaining more and more knowledge into his head. You know, the interesting thing is, as he was a patent attorney, and he was specialised in medical patents. And he figured, this is your pharmaceutical patents, I should say. The trick with this is, how am I going to argue things if I don't understand the chemical makeup of these things? So he became a chemist. You know, did a degree in chemistry. And he was just one of those, I think he was like Rudyard Kipling's Elephant's Child, you know, filled with an insatiable curiosity. And so that was how Fugitive Drift came about in terms of our family. I think a fair number of you have been to that part of the world. We're not going to dwell too much on the Anglo-Zulu War. Maybe we'll save that for another slightly cooler day. I'm sorry about the heat, but not much we could do about that. I thought I'd stand here in solidarity for those that have got the sun. I'll wear a bit of sun on my back. And so living in Johannesburg, they then decided that they wanted to retire. And they found a little piece of land that you're sitting on right now. This farm itself was there were three portions once it was divided up. This was portion 2. Portion 1 is the Mitchells next door, Royston Farm, and the remainder is on that side over there. It belongs to a chap called Klaus Belzer. And they chose, I think they were all available at the time actually, I could be wrong on that, but they chose this one for what you see behind me. It wasn't called Fairview for nothing. That was the name of the farm. And they decided to retire down here. There was nothing here at the time, and they built a little cottage, which is that building over there, and then set about building their retirement home, which Martin did. Anyone live in a Martin house, by the way? Anyone got a Martin Rattray designed house? How are your stairs? Oh, they're right. Yes. Because the one thing that Martin really struggled with was stairs. So you'll see on the big old houses, the stairs are actually on the outside to get upstairs, and it was the same on this building. And his reason behind that.
Peter Curlin's got stairs literally a foot in front of the front door.
Yes.
Straight up.
Yeah, and the same in the Curlin Pavilion. You hit your head. I think the thing about it was that Martin. And we're digressing a little bit onto Martin, but I think Martin's such a fascinating character as well, is that Martin designed the most generous and beautiful spaces, and he didn't want to ruin them with stairs, so it was easier to just put the stairs outside. I think. I could be wrong. But nevertheless, as I said to you, he changed Plet's architecture, I think for the better. I think almost any building that you see that is remotely Cape Dutch, or Cape Georgian in this part of the world was designed by him. Almost anything with sash windows, I think in a lot of ways was quite possibly done by him. And then of course those shiplap Hampton style beach houses that you see in town and down at Nature's Valley are also his. And so Martin came and lived down here with them. So now we move on to Fairview. I think let's keep it relevant to what's happening here. I'm conscious of going over time. How much more time have I got left?
Okay.
Because we can keep going for a while. There's lots of stories.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. I think 10's all right. We'll do another one, maybe, depending. We'll see. So anyway, Jill moved down here, and she wrote a lovely book. It was a diary to her mother, and it's called a Cape Country Chronicle, if I get the title correct. And it was letters that she wrote to her mother, and there are some wonderful tales of how this all came about in there. And I mean I can't share all of them with you, but if you do have a copy of that book, it's worth giving it another read. But you know, she hand painted all the murals on the walls, which are sadly no longer in the old house. But she and Martin and friends would hand paint the what you would call it, below the dado rails, and so they built that house while she was living here on her own, in fact, and Peter was still practicing, and he would come down here from time to time. One of the big issues we have on this property is no water. We've got no groundwater. You're all sitting on a 100,000 litre water tank. I mean, I'm not, I'm safe, if something goes wrong. But it hasn't gone wrong yet, it shouldn't. It's very over-engineered. But we rely pretty much on rainwater, and they then decided, and Jill was an incredible gardener, that's the other thing. I wish our gardens here at the moment could do her justice, and we're getting there. It's quite a, for those who love gardening, you'll know, it's quite a labour to get it all immaculate. And she had this beautiful garden, and they'd often have to go and fetch water to bring it in, and then started collecting rainwater. But that wasn't enough. They dug a little dam, and again, as you know, with this part of the world, it's feast or famine. We've either got lots of water or we've got none. And so they decided to sink a borehole. And the water diviner and the geologist and everyone all agreed that that was the spot. Sent it down about 120 meters. Water came out, lots of it. And you know, this was in the mid-80s. Put it into tanks, pump it across, water the garden. 10 days later, garden dead. Completely and utterly gone. The water is salty as anything. It's full of magnesium, manganese, and iron, and salt. And anyway, we now can clean it with reverse osmosis. Of course, we try not to do too much of that, because it's not the most efficient way of doing water. But she managed to create a garden here out of using rainwater alone for 30 years. And Martin then came and lived down here with them, and to tell you the story of these buildings here. So Martin built a little cottage, which was this building over here. This was his sitting room. Kitchen was where our kitchen is now, and he lived upstairs, and then he expanded it bit by bit, and I'm sure those of you who had houses designed by him spent quite a lot of time in here, and probably with quite a lot of whiskey. Yeah. Lots. There we go. Probably a bit too much. And then eventually he built the coach house, which is on the far side over there. And that's essentially the Fairview that you see. Aside from what we've done to it, Martin did let it fall into a bit of disrepair. We'll leave it at that. But in 2003, Peter and Jill decided that they wanted to move to Swellendam, and so up there they left, and my father bought this property from them in 2003, inherited Martin as part of the sales. He had a lifetime right of habitation here. And that was an interesting 15 years, to say the least. But what Martin left us with was this magnificent building, or buildings. Everything had to be redone because it had fallen by the wayside a little bit. But Martin died in January 2018, and so 2019 we fixed it all up and opened our doors on the 15th of March 2020 and closed them 7 days later. It's been an interesting 2 years. I like to think of it as a sort of soft opening. We're only opening now. In fact, this is our grand opening party, by the way. So drink with me downstairs. We have been going for a while. But yeah, so, and then they retired to Swellendam. And the other thing I think that's really important to touch on with Peter and Jill was how involved they were in the community, playing bowls here at the Curling Club when it was still very much functional as a bowls club. Got involved in local politics, and I mean the irony is that all the workies at his law firm, I think, must have been quite interested in the fact that when he moved down here, he learned how to speak Afrikaans. And he was quite good with languages. I mean, now if I go back to the 40s during the war, you know, he could do a bit of barroom Spanish. I think gleaned largely from rather interesting places in Buenos Aires while shipping things, and particularly Argentine beef during the war. And then again, time on the mines as an engineer, he learned how to speak a smattering of Zulu and Fanagalo. You don't know Fanagalo? Yeah. And it's Fanagalo's kind of disappeared. Because more and more people are becoming fluent in isiZulu and isiXhosa. And so he came down here and he learned how to speak Afrikaans, got involved in local politics. In fact, I would imagine, I don't know, how old is the Von Plettenberg Historical Society?
1980.
1980. I'm sure he would have been a member.
Yes, he was.
He had to have been. There's no ways he wouldn't have been. Because he became a member of the Swellendam Historical Society and fixed a lot of things there and got the archives going and dispensed with plenty of advice of the legal kind. And he was very free with that. And yeah, they retired to Swellendam, 14 Berg Street it was. I'm sure some of you probably went and saw them there. And again, a little cottage with a beautiful garden, as was always Jill's way. Jill died in 2019, in June. And Peter died on the 1st of February this year, 2 days short of his 98th birthday. He'd had a good innings, and you know the amazing thing about this man is that until the day he died, he was as sharp as a button. And to give you an idea of that, when we moved down here and I was now investigating how we could solve our water problem, aside from catching more off the roof, but you can't catch what doesn't fall.
Yeah.
So we needed some sort of backup, and technology is now available to clean salty water and so on. And I said, I don't want to go to the expense of sinking another borehole to find salty water when we have one already. Except no one knew where the borehole was. Right, Peter will know. Phoned him up, and he was 96 years old at the time, and he said, oh my boy, if you walk along and you go to the gate, there's a little gate on the side of the road, and if you walk 167 paces, you'll find it under an overturned old cast iron bath. Well, and he hadn't seen this thing they closed it up immediately once it was salty. I went there, opened it up, and there was this hole. So he was as sharp as anything until the day he died. So there's a little bit of the history of Fairview, how we became involved in fugitive drift, and this really interesting doyen of South African society, certainly of the legal fraternity in Johannesburg. But yeah, an incredible character, and I think leaves a legacy of incredible beauty. Everything he touched seemed to turn, or he only touched beautiful things, perhaps. And that's, I think Fairview's a testament to them, as is Fugitive Drift. And I hope that you found this little insight into our family history. There's a lot more to it, but we won't. Some of it's not really for public consumption, as most family histories are. But yeah, an incredible life, and a life lived to the full, I think. Yeah. Just a tiny little bit of housekeeping. Lunch is going to be served in two places, one inside and one outside. So you all know that we're doing a butter chicken curry. I've let the grass grow long for the vegetarians. So feel free to. No, I'm kidding. There is a vegetarian option, but for those that are non-chicken eaters, the vegetarian option will be inside. All right, and the rest will be outside. And there are salads going with it, and sambles, etc. And then dessert will be plated. The bar, you know where that is. And please do enjoy yourselves. I hope that those in the sun haven't cooked too much, because it is rather warm. I'm certainly feeling it standing here. I think the back of my ears are going to be rather red this evening. But thank you all very much for coming. And Len, thank you for this opportunity, and Leslie, and for your organisation. It's always wonderful.
Thank you, Andrew, for a wonderful talk, and We hope that you and your family, I met Nell, and your lovely daughters are going to be very, very happy and blessed. It's nice to have you here, and we wanted to know and wanted to think about something to give you as a present. And seeing that you have a shortage of water, Plettenberg Bay is close by, and the sea is close by, so you've got a knife to open up. This is a card.
Oh wow!
And let's open it up.
This is rather exciting. I mean, it's we play guess. Can we play guess what it is?
Yeah, you can guess.
I think I'm going to get it so horribly wrong. But
We'll try. What do you think?
we're talking of the sea, fish.
Oh, you're pretty close. Keep it.
I don't want to drop it.
No, don't.
Don't cut it either.
It comes from the porcupine.
I think it's a dolphin.
Outside it shows damn it all.
Oh, wonderful!
Hold on.
Thank you very much.
That's pretty.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to the Historical Society. I should probably join it, but I might be a bit young. I don't know. Where did that one come? I remember that. Who said I resemble that remark? No, I've heard it before. But thank you all very much. And please do enjoy yourselves. And I'm going to turn this off now.